My name is Julie Watkins, and I will be hosting today's Travelogue, brought to you by the Geographic Society of Chicago. Since 1898, the Geographic Society of Chicago has educated the public about geography and its important uses. Today's GSC trains students in the latest geospatial technology. Through services such as our community mapping projects, we offer unique educational experiences that harness the power of maps and the integrative tools of GIS to solve environmental and community issues. Together, our board and membership provide educational opportunities for students and educators, assist in building geographic materials collections in educational and cultural institutions, promote new and emerging technologies and problem solving, and much more. With us to present today is Melanie Kirby. Melanie Kirby is an interdisciplinary queen breeder and educator who integrates Western sustainable agriculture science with traditional ecological knowledge. She has been breeding adaptive bee stock for over 2 decades through her farm, Zia Queen Bees Farm and Field Institute, based in the Southern Rocky Mountains. She collaborates with breeders, beekeepers, and scientists across the globe on applied research and education efforts. She is a National Geographic explorer and also works as the extension educator for the Institute of American Indian Arts, working with diverse communities on regenerative food systems research. You can follow her efforts on Instagram at Zia Queen Bees and at Nectar Nomad. With that, I will pass things over to Melanie for today's presentation. Thank you for being here, Melanie.
Thank you so much, Julie. And thank you all for inviting me to come and spend a little bit of time with you all. So this is exciting. I'm actually beaming in from Santa Fe, New Mexico. So a little bit of ways, but also there in spirit for sure. I think Zoomlandia tends to keep us alone together, which has really been one of the sort of positives to come out of this current situation. But yeah, and in fact, my presentation, while I want to focus on what I was able to get to learn and see, and the folks I was able to interact with while I was in Spain, my project was actually impacted by the pandemic. So I only got to be there for half of the time that I had intended. And so I do hope to go back, but this is a little taster of that. And actually my presentation will focus the first half really on sort of not only who I am, but the journey I've been on and how the bees have really helped me connect to communities around the world and just find many opportunities to continue learning and to continue sharing. And so you all are part of that journey, and I really appreciate getting to spend time with you all. So yeah, I'm calling this How the Bees as Seeds Experience Unfurls, and a glimpse at Iberian apiculture through the perfume stories from what I like to phrase as the hive mind to collective human consciousness. And that's alluding, of course, to how much the bees have taught me in terms of their teamwork and their cooperation as not only as individual organisms, but definitely as their collective superorganism. And there's a lot of things that not only we humans have been fascinated with in regards to them, but many things we can learn from them. And especially as it connects to space and place and purpose, really, and even power, and power meaning more responsibility in terms of reciprocity. And so I'll start off with a little short video that is 3 minutes long, but it's my introduction about myself. I took a digital storytelling workshop right after the pandemic when I was in lockdown, like everybody else. And it really helped me to sort of synthesize and sort of recalibrate or get my bearings again, in this sort of unknown future that we're all navigating together. But looking back on where we come from and our connections to not only our roots can also really help us to figure out which direction we want to go, and in which space we want to pursue our future path.
I've traveled many a bumpy road in the darkest of nights, serving as a chauffeur to beings of sweet starlight. I migrate with them, like a shepherd, roaming with my flock of winged midwives, as a fellow follower of the bloom, a self-proclaimed nectar nomad. I was introduced to this artistic science of beekeeping 2 decades ago, as a U.S. Peace Corps volunteer collaborating with peasant farmers in South America. The bees captivated my curious mind, and working in an outdoor office made of fresh air, flowers, and freedom enticed my soul. My nomadic journey as an apiculturist has taken me far from where I could ever have imagined, having come from a humble home in Pueblo Indian country in New Mexico. My heritage is a mosaic of cellular memories influenced by my Native American ancestors, who instilled in me a profound reverence for place and purpose, and to pursue acts of community service. So I chose to become a bee farmer, as I wanted to continue to learn from Mother Nature and Father Time. As a farmer, I share beekeepers' voices of concern and need for adaptation and innovation to fulfill our dedication for local to global food production. Sharing their challenges, I became encouraged to return to academia to help quantify their observations and advocate for pollinator conservation. Now, as a researcher, my quest to better understand the relationship between cultures, food systems, and stewardship is at the forefront of my thoughts. Honeybees are like some of us and our ancestors, immigrants to this country. They have adapted and become the backbone of agriculture. There are distinct ecotypes or subspecies of honeybees like races in humans, and these ecotypes carry genetic histories like seas which contain their very existence and memories of creation. For within each one, they have the power to nurture and adapt, and the magnificence to create life, food, and medicine for the world. One of the things I most enjoy about beekeeping is that it bridges cultures and goes beyond borders. It connects us to our origins as fellow beings of light, as a part of this land, not separate from it. This magnificence is alluring and inspires me to find and connect with bees and their keepers around the globe. I invite you all to accompany me on my nectar nomad storytelling journey as I chase the bloom, encounter cultures, and follow the liquid starlight known as honey from flora to flavor to feast.
So that's a little bit about me and where I come from. And I share this because a lot of times when we think of, our work out in the world, whether it's our career path or even just our interests, we tend to just put one foot in front of the other, but really not necessarily turn around and see, this longer trek that we've been making, and these twists and turns and these unexpected sort of avenues or paths that open up for us. And I've really found that my own particular journey within apiculture, and just as what I used to call myself as a closet academic who's finally come out of the closet, so to speak, really, I see these patterns, and I also see that there's been this sort of self-guided discovery that I didn't necessarily plan. And in fact, when I first decided to become a beekeeper, I was a Peace Corps volunteer, which is how I got started. And I had done that because my mother had been a Peace Corps volunteer when it had first gotten started in the late 60s. She had served in the French Grenadines on a small fishing island called St. Vincent. And after her service, she stayed a little longer. And on the last day of her time there, and she was traveling back to New Mexico, she met my father. So I just remember growing up hearing that it was just such a real educational experience for her. And she didn't talk about it often, but when she did talk about it, it really made an impact on me. So I knew from a very young age that I wanted to do the Peace Corps, that I wanted to be of service. And part of that definitely connects to, when I reflect back and look at my, my trek here, to my heritage, and to being a part of a larger community and having that sense of responsibility to whatever space and place I'm in. So this is actually a photo of me as a Peace Corps volunteer, and sort of the twists and turns that this story takes is that, my life plan after getting my bachelor's from a small liberal arts school called St. John's College, was that I was going to do Peace Corps, and then I was going to move to San Francisco and be a DJ. And so that whole plan changed. I did definitely do Peace Corps, but that's when the bees found me. So here's a few photos of me where I was stationed in Paraguay in South America, and some of the kids I got to work with. With the youth, I actually did some stingless bee projects. And then with the women farmers, or what we call the campesinas, I would do some beekeeping and other animal husbandry and food and garden projects. Afterwards, I had actually made a really good friend while in Peace Corps who had grown up in Hawaii. She now works for USAID and has lived all over the world. And her mother had come to visit and had invited me out to Hawaii. And coming from New Mexico, I thought, wow, I'm getting an invitation to go to Hawaii. And she had a small gardenia farm, so I got to go and work out there. And while I was there, I actually learned that there were several large-scale queen honeybee rearing operations. And I had no idea that the apiculture industry, or at least the American beekeeping industry, was so multifaceted. So I ended up staying 5 years actually out on the Big Island of Hawaii, learning how to rear queen bees. And so I came from a very rustic experience of living out in the jungles of South America, catching wild swarms with machetes, having to make all of our own equipment without power tools, to all of a sudden factory farming USA. And it was very interesting because I got to really see, how beekeeping is practiced in various communities, and also with various resources, right, depending on the landscape. And so the bees really did introduce me to the larger concepts of climate and weather, and topographies, and how those all come into play when you're looking at the various flora and even the fauna that exists somewhere, and how all of those have relationships and interact with each other. And so it was really sort of mind expanding for me, at being in my 20s at the time. After being there for 5 years, I actually ended up going to work for a migratory beekeeper in Florida. And so I went all of a sudden from working to the world's largest queen producers in Hawaii to working to what was called a mid-scale or mid-size producer. He ran about 5,000 colonies, which is still a lot, but he migrated with his bees between Wisconsin and Florida, following the flows. And so he would, of course, spend the winters in Florida and then his summers up in Wisconsin. He milled and put together all of his own woodenware, all his own hive boxes. He did everything himself. And so, coming from the rustic experience of my Peace Corps days to all of a sudden this huge factory farming USA, to now all of a sudden working for a mid-sized producer who really was extremely conscientious. Again, I had this opportunity to kind of witness and firsthand, the varying approaches to beekeeping, and also, again, these connections to place and space. While working in Florida, I met my farm partner, who was from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So this is actually a photo of Michigan. And so we decided to team up. I was actually supposed to go to New Zealand after working in Florida, but somehow I chose the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And yeah, we've been working together now for almost 18 years. So what we ended up doing was we became migratory beekeepers ourselves, and moved half of his stock to Florida for the winter, of course, and then back to Michigan. And then since I had queen rearing skills, I convinced him to multiply his numbers. So I helped him multiply them. And he had 50 at the time. We got him up to 100 hives. And then I said, why don't we take them to New Mexico, which is my home area? But I had never kept bees in my home area, and I do not come from a farming family. So we really learned together how to do that. And he was a little apprehensive because, you know, thinking of the Southwest and thinking of these aggressive bee strains, these killer bees that are, you know, down in the Southwest. But he was very pleasantly surprised that New Mexico, if you haven't been here, it has everything from desert to tundra, and we are in the southernmost tip of the Rocky Mountains. But then we also have desert landscapes too. So our lowest point of elevation, I believe, is 2,900 feet, and our highest point goes over 13,000. So we have a very crenellated landscape. We also have a very critical lack of water. We have the Rio Grande, which is our main water source. And we really rely a lot on snowpack from these mountains that then drain into the Rio Grande. But there's also over 19 sovereign nations that are in this area, and Tortugas Pueblo, my community, is one of those. And so there's been a lot of ancestral practices here that have proven their adaptiveness and their resiliency. They've never been displaced. We actually don't call them reservations. They're pueblos that have always been here. They're communities that have always been here. And you also have the Diné or Navajo as well, and you have also Apache folks here. So there's a lot of different indigenous communities in this space who have really learned how to read the landscape and work with it. And so here it was, I convinced my farm partner to bring half his bee stock here, and you know, let's try it here where even I wasn't sure how to keep bees. And so we've practiced together. A lot of folks also have been informed, you know, that honeybees aren't native to the Americas, which is mostly true. However, there is fossil evidence of our own North American native honeybee, which was called Apis mellifera nearctica. They found fossils that were 14 million years old in some deposits in Nevada. So I like to consider our modern day honeybees as sort of reintroduced cousins to that ancestor bee. This is a photo of me at my home farm getting ready to do a process called grafting, which I'll talk about a little bit here in a minute. So this grafting process is really selecting the right age larva, honeybee larva, that's been fertilized, and then just transferring it to these special little cups here. So similar to plant grafting, you're moving genetic material, but very different from plant grafting. There's no slicing and dicing involved. It's literally just transferring a larva that's floating on a bed of royal jelly into a special cup, and then giving them back to hives that are rearing queens. And so here's sort of a little breakdown of that process. Here's a frame actually of comb that's got some larvae in it from what we have designated as a breeder colony. I do the process of grafting. You can't see this photo very well, but there's these little tiny crescent, hopefully you can see my cursor, these little crescents there, and that's the larva that are floating on the liquid royal jelly. They then go into these nursery hives that then rear all of these larvae. They keep feeding them royal jelly. And so this middle shot here is actually of ripe queen bee cocoons. And then each one of these cocoons is handled very gently and then taken out to a mating apiary or bee yard, where they each get a new home. And so each cocoon is placed on this is actually brood comb. So these are developing babies in here, placed there within the nest. And then they're able to keep them at temperature. And within a couple days, they'll emerge. They'll go out and mate and do open mating. They will actually mate with anywhere from 5 to 20 drones, which are the males. And then those semen stores, they actually store and use for the rest of their life. So they only have a defined mating period at the beginning of their lives. So here's a mated queen bee. There's an international color code. So with non-toxic, no odor, water-based paint pens, we will put a colored dot on the queen's back. And that allows us to not only spot her more easily, like a needle in the haystack, trying to find a queen bee in a box full of bees, but also to keep track of her age. And so within my own breeding program, having learned about, how these larger commercial operations were rearing queens, and then also combining it with my own traditional ecological knowledge in terms of my indigenous worldview, and really wanted to select strains that were naturally resilient, it allows me to really select from the oldest queens that I have to become breeders. So I describe myself as a seed saver of sorts, where the bees are the seeds, hence the title of this presentation. And each one of these queen bees is then harvested and placed in a little cage with some attendants, which are these, her daughters right here. And this picture right here actually are these cages with little drops of honey on them to give them some food, but there's also a little fondant candy tube in there. And then they get shipped all around for beekeepers who are needing to either replace hives or who want to integrate some diverse genetics, or for beekeepers who are just starting out as well. So here's another very short little video just sort of describing this process in a little bit more detail.
Everybody would like to try and find something that is perfect for where they're at, the super plant, the super bee. And Mother Nature doesn't have, a one-size-fits-all model, and rightly so. I mean, just look at the varying landscapes of the world. %70 of the food we eat is pollinated by bees, or has some derivation from honeybee pollination. Bees are a very integrative part of, human evolution, and of course just food production. And so we run our bees through the mountains and the valleys. We like having our bees up here in the mountains during the summer because there's a really good flow. We do keep some here for the winter for overwintering assessment. We are surrounded by forests. We've got Santa Fe National Forest, Pecos National Forest, and Carson National Forest, all kind of converge right here in the Southern Rockies. People need hardy bees. If you have naturally hardy bees, then the hope is that they're strong enough on their own to deal with what I call the diversity and adversity, the changing conditions. And here in New Mexico, we have so many different microclimates, and so having bees that can adapt to the varying conditions is really important, at least for us, because we've chosen to live here. Queen rearing is extremely satisfying work for me, I think, in that it's, queens are the heart of their hive. They're the ones that are passing on the lineage. They're the ones that are giving, their progeny the ability to deal or not deal with certain situations. One of the differences that we do with our rearing is we select our own breeders. We purposely give everybody 2 years. We don't requeen every year and just get rid of, only keep young queens. The older they are, the better they are for us in what we do, because we feel that if they've lasted that long, then they can really handle a lot. And that's the type of genetics naturally that we want to promote. Out of all the thousands of bees in a hive, there's only one queen bee. And they're very committed and they have very devoted followers. Hives will create a new queen under certain conditions. In our situation, we mimic some of these conditions. These are our cell builders, and they're actually making queens. The queen is in the couple bottom boxes, laying away. That's her main nursery. And the bigger the hive gets, the more boxes we add. And the more boxes that you add, the ones on the top can't smell her pheromones as strongly. So when you give them the right age larvae, they will make them into queens. These are all going to be new mamas. When these queens emerge, they will pipe to find the other queens. And they'll go, ring, 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 ring. To me, it sounds really funny because I've heard it so many times that it's really high pitched and it just sounds like little, Morse code vibration, like zzz, 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 zzz. And then they will fight to the death. And may The winter rain, I guess.
Any bees he can say that you're made from mud and clay, and the nest you have for honey's in the torso of a boy. Any
So yeah, so that describes the process a little better, or at least our perspective on it. But you can really see that, you know, there is this this process that's directly involved with the landscape. And what has been really awesome about being in the Southern Rockies is that we're really rather isolated up there. So we're not very close to big ag and to a lot of the issues that can come out of monocrop agriculture. Doesn't mean that we're completely safe. We're actually about 50 miles as the crow flies, or as the bee flies, from one of the national laboratories. So they have found some, you know, remnants of things that are, you know, undesirable. But in terms of open mating and being able to, through a process of biomimicry, really nurture the natural processes for queen bee production and mating, it's really a fabulous spot. This is a photo actually in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan of my farm partner, where daylight is, you know, really, really long in the summer. You all there in Chicago can recognize this, you know, just being at that far north of a latitude, you know, where it doesn't get dark until really late in the summer. So despite it being a shorter season, it's actually really, really a productive area because there's so much daylight in the summer. And so you can see these hives, this actually only has one queen, but they can really start to pack away a lot of honey. And that's because they know they've got so many months of winter that they need to have some food stores for. These are some of the queen cocoons, and you can see right here in the upper part of these little cups, this sort of whitish material in there, that's the royal jelly, which is age defying. So a queen can live for several years, whereas her daughters during the warm season may only live, you know, 4 to 6 weeks thereabouts, because they're literally working themselves to death. The ones that overwinter with her, because they don't necessarily hibernate, they actually go into cluster and will rotate around and eat those food reserves that they've stored. Those bees can actually live several months because they're not out, you know, actively flying and wearing themselves out. But royal jelly is one of those substances that they need. And so having really good pollen and protein resources, which means having really good soil and really good blooms and a variety of blooms, a variety of nutrition, is pretty essential for their health. And there's our illustrious queen bee right there, who's being fed by her attendants. This is what we call her retinue. And so they kind of corral her around the hive. And you can actually, in these cells right here back by her tail, you can see some of the developing young. Honeybees do undergo metamorphosis, so they do emerge from an egg. They hatch from an egg, and then they are a larva, and then they will actually spin a cocoon and undergo, you know, pupation, and then emerge as an adult. Little did I know when I started that bees would really take me around the world and have me following the blooms, so to speak. But I've, you know, in that vein of wanting to be of service, I've been able to do several volunteer positions as a technician or as an educator. And so getting to see the landscape is in different places, getting to try the honeys. I actually am a huge honey collector. Anywhere I go, that's one of the first things I like to get is the honey, because the various blooms, just like wine, honey has its own terroir, and it can really actually vary even in the same place between spring and fall harvests. So all of these different honeys can taste so different. And the process of discovering these flavors is something, again, for a person like myself who loves to eat and a little too much, being on these gastronomical tours, these varying landscapes and of these different geographies is fascinating. It's never ending what you can come into contact with. So this is actually a photo of a few different honeys from around the world, and you can see the differences in colors and even in consistencies as well. Here's part of my collection. It's grown definitely over the years, but I had the opportunity to go to Italy and trade honey with a few different folks. And so down here is rhododendron honey, which actually there's rhododendron honey from Nepal has actually psychedelic properties. I've never tried it. Maybe at some point I will. Castagno honey, which is actually chestnut honey, wildflower honey, acacia honey. This little honey up here with the blue cap, that's actually honey from stingless bees, which is very different in flavor and consistency. And I also have some picture. I think this is somewhere over here. I have some honey. Oh, this one right here. I think this one's from Kenya that's upside down with the yellow cap. And so it really has become this sort of like this quest of mine to just see as much of it as I can. But in order not only to better understand it, but to help advocate for farmers and for beekeepers and for land stewards. I mentioned some of the volunteer opportunities I had. So I did 2 stints as a USAID farmer to farmer exchange technician, and got to go and teach some workshops and visit beekeepers in Jamaica, also to Morocco, and then being able to exchange knowledge and to really, I call it, nectar for our noggin, right? And to savor each other's information and to learn from each other. With that in mind, here's some of my harvests from up in New Mexico. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of different microclimates here. So it's always sort of a mixed bag, which you're going to get. And then being able to share those with beekeepers in other places. I've had the opportunity to go to France. You may have heard of the hives that were on top of Notre Dame when they had the fire. This is the family. This is Kenton Géant, and his father is Nicolas Géant, and they own what's called Beekeepers based in Versailles, but they keep a lot of their hives on the top of various different organizations and sort of brands. I think they even have hives on top of the Louis Vuitton, shop and stuff. But the hives did survive. The bees did survive from this fire, and they've actually now opened up a small operation in Oakland, California. So what's interesting is that bees really can take you around the world, not for only for us Americans, but for other folks. And a lot of the beekeepers I actually worked with when I was in Hawaii were from other countries, which that really, I think, subconsciously fed into my desire and interest in wanting to learn more about bees in other places, because they would come during their cold season to work there and to learn about queen rearing, and then be able to take that experience back to share with their beekeepers. These are some beekeepers in Italy. And again, these are ones in Morocco. All this sort of going around and seeing different beekeepers, but also really recognizing my own interest in wanting to better understand, how I could be a better seed saver, how I could also help to bridge the gap or bridge the communication gap and help build the bridge between the field and academia. I decided to finally go back to school. So after being in the field for 22 years, I decided to go back and get my master's, which I just finished in May of this year. And one of the, multiple reasons for doing it, of course, but I really wanted to help quantify all the decades and years of observations that beekeepers and farmers have, but they may not necessarily be able to express it in the same way as Western science. And of course, I'm coming at this from a mixed heritage, background, where I recognize that there's various knowledge systems. And so it's been a growing goal of mine to really help make that table longer, but also to promote inclusivity for these various knowledge systems, especially as we look at, these various changes and shifts in our global patterns that we, in order for us to survive, not only as a species, but to promote biodiversity, we really need a lot more translators. So I ended up going to Washington State University, which has a really renowned bee breeding lab. I did mating behavior research and was looking at how various strains of bees. So what folks may not realize is that, we have over 20,000 kinds of bees globally. Many of them are solitary, or what we call eusocial bees, and a lot of them too are very plant specific. They've really co-evolved with particular blooms, and of those 20,000, one of those is honeybees, right? And then within the honeybee species, there's actually close to 30 subspecies, or these races or strains. And so trying to find those ones that are adaptive but also resilient has been this professional quest of mine. And part of that is due to the fact that, they've all come from, this sort of parent honeybee, but they are very much immigrants, like a lot of folks in this country, where they have followed, these various resources and food, and have learned how to adapt. And so then they've become their own ecotype. So there's their genotype, and then now you have their phenotype, which is really more a product of their genes being shaped and sculpted more by their environment. And so that really, which is also called epigenetics, and that's sort of like what's consumed my world now as I go into year 25 of professional beekeeping. But in this photo, I actually teamed up with some undergraduate engineering students for their senior design project, and utilizing RFID, or radio frequency identification, to monitor when these various queen bee strains were going out to mate, and then also seeing if that changed depending on the weather. So here's a photo of those little tags on the back of this is actually on the back of a drone. The males they actually die right after mating. So I would get a lot of readings of them leaving, but never coming back, which is a good sign, right? They're casting their seeds, right, in that sense. But it's very interesting to monitor tiny insects, and they are tougher than we think, that's for sure. But still very fragile, as we have these shifting weather patterns, we're getting a lot of plant pollinator interactions that are sort of becoming out of sync. Bloom times are occurring either earlier or later, and you have certain species of these bees, especially some of the solitary ones, their circadian clocks are also off, and they're emerging, the phenology of things is really changing. And so there's this unsyncness that's happening, which is something that I'm hoping that my research and my efforts to combine TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, with Western sustainable agriculture science can really help to give us more opportunities for learning how to adapt and how to be proactive in our stewardship. So this is actually, knowing that my experience where I'm at, and meeting these beekeepers in other places, and knowing that their experiences are changing too, really has allowed me to connect with additional organizations such as Slow Food, which they look to promote artisanal, but also traditional practices for food production, as opposed to fast food or processed foods, and to meet beekeepers from all over. So getting to my Spanish story, these are some of the Spanish beekeepers that I met, and that I was able to collaborate with for my research fellowship. Also doing some collaborative research with various institutions, such as this is New Mexico State University, and we did a research project on this is Monarda fistulosa down here, variety menthifolia, and it's actually what we call oregano de la sierra, or oregano from the mountains. It's a bee balm, but it's got very much of an oregano flavor, and the pollinators love it, honeybees included. And we had noticed that we had some bees that were not doing well, and when we brought them down here, they started to do better. So then we applied for a grant and got a chemist on board, and also horticulturists, so that we could better understand this. So again, really looking at how landscapes connect to health and to longevity. And again, longevity is a heritable trait. So as a breeder, I go, oh, wow, you know, genetics are part of the story, but it's also that environment and that nutrition that it can provide. And the stewardship that we lend to it really creates this tandem of, or this choreography that is really quite fascinating. I wanted to better understand, you know, where these reintroduced cousins, right, really came from. And so that got me thinking more as I was in grad school too, about trying to apply for a fellowship, to a Fulbright fellowship, to go and research endemic honeybees in Spain. And so as I mentioned, you know, there's close to 30 subspecies. They all look a little different. So, you know, we also tend to think, oh, honeybees are black and yellow, but some are very dark. This actually right down here in the bottom right are what you call Caucasian bees, believe it or not, from the Caucasus Mountains. And so they're a good cold weather bee. And then you've got what we've got, Apis mellifera ligustica, Apis mellifera carnica, you've got all sorts of different kinds, but a subset were brought over to the Americas, and as settlers came, and then as you know, it's a very long, arduous trip, and so not all of them made it. And so as bees started to adapt and really proliferate just on our own continent, importation ceased. And then with the advent of steamships, more were brought over, and from farther away, from Egypt and from other places. But then in the 20s, they shut the borders due to what was called the Isle of Wight disease, which is a tracheal mite. It's microscopic. And that rule is still on the books today. So technically, honeybees from other places can't just come in. And at Washington State University, where I was doing my graduate research, you know, they were able, with a lot of permits and a lot of screening and coordination between USDA and other research labs, they were able to bring in semen from the drones from these hives, but they can't actually bring in the bees. And then through a process of back crossing, they are actually, through instrumental insemination, able to get to about 97% of the original stock line. And the reason for that is that we've seen with our American bees, they're very much a reflection of our peoples. They've become sort of a melting pot, and we don't have our own real ecotype here. And of course, just looking at our own country and how diverse it is in landscapes, you know, one bee, like I mentioned in the video, that one super bee doesn't really exist. You know, there's a super bee for each region. But with our practices here in the States of larger scale pollination events and migratory beekeepers trucking bees from as far away as Maine all the way to California, et cetera, our bees have become sort of this melting pot. And because they shut the borders, and also with industrialized agriculture, you have, you know, fewer operations producing more and more, and their genetic stock lines are, you know, beginning to experience bottlenecks. And so these efforts to bring in some of these genetics from quote unquote the old world are to help broaden the genetic pool. And they're bringing in semen from bees that have natural resistance to various pests and diseases. And so again, looking at, you know, not only that, but compound it with changing weather, compound it with overuse of pesticides or other toxic chemicals, you know, compromised waterways and airways. You know, these insects really are a canary in the coal mine, so to speak, and letting us recognize just how fragile our ecosystems are, and how our stewardship really does impact, but can also play a part in modifying the future, right? And this goes back to, for me, a lot of my own heritage, in that seeing that, you know, this legacy of continuity, whether it's genetic strains or stories or traditions or practices, not only the bees themselves continuing, but the beekeepers themselves continuing, can really only better be understood by looking at our past. Once we can see where we've come from, then I think we can better direct where we intend to go, and with intention. And so that brought me to my fellowship proposal. I wanted to go to Spain because it's a really interesting area of the world, not only being that it's, right north of Africa and then connected to Western Europe, but even just on a cultural level, coming myself from an area that was very heavily colonized by the Spanish and wanting to learn how to reconcile. I myself am mestiza, so I've got these various what we call blood memories from all over. My last name's Irish, go figure. So I mean, as American as we can all be, right, we've got all these various stories and histories coming in, and the better we can recognize our past, can we really reconcile and move forward in our futures. And so that was why I chose to go to Spain. I arrived in November of 2020, and 2019, and hit the ground running. Really, I got to go to a honey expo in Cordoba, which is where I was stationed in Andalusia in the southern part of Spain. And got to see all of their really cool different honeys, from cilantro, avocado, oak. They have all these different kinds of honeys, rosemary, just super delicious honeys. And the camaraderie is really sincere. I mean, beekeeping has been here a really long time. And in fact, the world's oldest cave painting of honey hunters is found in Spain. And there really is an art and a wisdom that comes out of this connection between, humans and our interactions and our husbandry or stewardship of these bees. But really, in a sense, they're stewarding us, right? So here's some photos of the native honeybees there, Apis mellifera iberiensis. This is actually one of their native honeybees on some rosemary flowers. This is me with a couple of beekeepers there, some of my good beekeeping buddies. They use a hive style called a lions, which is kind of like a small trunk. This bee kind of photobombed us there. They were very much like, our bees are really feisty, and they were pretty feisty, but they weren't as feisty as the ones in South America. I'll put it that way. This is actually a shot of Los Melizos, which is near Malaga, and I apologize because I didn't get a chance to correct my map. This is the Valencia. This number 11 up here on the map is actually where those cave paintings are found. But this particular shot is actually on the costa, near the Costa del Sol, closer to Malaga. And this is Alonso Panadero, who's actually a beekeeper and a baker, hence his name Panadero. But he, this is a lot of olives, and similar to the almonds in the US, it's kind of like this big bloom. And then once it's done, it kind of becomes a food desert. And so he takes his bees up to the hills where they can get some of these other wildflower blooms during that time. So looking at these landscapes, talking about the olives, I mean, these are just all olive groves for miles and miles and miles. I had the opportunity to rent a small house. When I first got there, my counterparts were thinking I wanted to live in the city, because doesn't every person want to live in the city? And you all live near the city. And I was like, no, I'm a farmer. I want to live in the countryside. So I actually rented a small little country home from an olive grower. And he was not a beekeeper, but he hosted hives near his olive groves. And so behind this hill is actually where his groves are. And on this side, there's actually a huge oak stand. And so he allows a beekeeper to bring in his hives. So these are a bunch of hives there in the background near Adamuz. And just being able to see these varying landscapes and learning more about their weather patterns. I had never been to Spain before, so I was kind of surprised at how chilly it was and wet and cold when I arrived, especially being in the southern part of Spain. But even I did have the opportunity to go up north, and I'll share a little bit about that and really see the differences in their landscape, which reminded me a lot of my own home area, these differences between elevational changes. So this is a rendition of that cave painting. It's called the Man of Beak, or it should be called the Woman. And it's found in the Cuevas de las Arañas, or spider cave, in Valencia. And his niece actually painted a rendition, and he was just so excited about this rendition. This is a professional beekeeper I got to meet, because she had painted it on a rock that's in the same shape as Spain is. And so he was he was really proud of this. And it's such a cute rendition. He had a little museum next to his shop. And so he had different miniatures of what beekeeping used to be like and how it's changed over the years, some of the various equipment that had been used in the past. And then, pairing that with how adaptive even these beekeepers are, and now the tools that they're using, including these big water tanks for, taking to these remote sites where there wasn't a lot of water, or for even hauling sugar syrup if there was a drought, or if they didn't get a particular flow, or they just needed to help supplement, and these large trucks that they would drive to move their bees. This particular beekeeper who's in the first shot, he actually does a lot with wax. And so beekeepers will bring him their wax, he will melt it down and then press it out into hexagonal sheets that then these beekeepers come and pick up and then put back in their hives as sort of a template for their bees to build off of. And that's just so different than here in the States, where a lot of our pressed wax is, you order it, but it's coming from who knows where. And wax is actually a pretty special material. I mean, the bees will consume over 20 pounds of nectar to sweat out 1 pound of wax, or to excrete it. And that's what they then use to have all these thousands of seamstresses in their hive, create their comb. But their comb is their central nervous system. It's their spinal column, it's their memory board, their communications board, it's their nursery, it's their pantry. And it can actually absorb a lot of what they come into contact with. So I found it super refreshing to find an operator who would take your own wax and reconstitute it in a way that you could use it and you get your own wax back. Whereas in the States, you kind of order it and you don't know where it's coming from, really. And if it's coming from big ag, there's definitely a higher chance of it having a lot of residual contaminants in it, which also adds to a strain on bee health. What's also really interesting is there's a huge practice right along the Costa del Sol. Pretty much once you leave Malaga right up here on the map and head towards Almeria, this whole area right here is just completely covered in greenhouses. So Spain is actually the breadbasket of Europe, and they grow a lot of fruits and veggies that then go to other parts of Europe, which have very strict standards. But these greenhouses allow them to get a little bit of season extension. And then what ends up happening is that the bees are used for pollination, but honeybees actually don't do well in greenhouses. So you have these beekeepers who are relying on this as an income, but then it really does affect their livestock. And so then they're having to try and recuperate a lot of losses in a pretty sort of faulty, unsustainable system. I'll just kind of breeze through this because I realize that I'm going to hit time here soon and I wanted to leave some time for questions, but I'm also really fascinated with ceramics and pottery. And so there actually is a lot of different uses of clay within apiculture, not only for honey pots, but also for hives themselves. From the Egyptians to the Spaniards and African cultures as well, using a lot of clay for their various practices with beekeeping. And so I got to meet a few different ceramicists, which was pretty exciting. And again, I had to get whisked back because the pandemic really started to take hold when I was halfway through my time there. So I'm hoping to go back and visit all of these folks. But yeah, learning how to also be a storyteller about, these experiences. I ran into this wonderful place called the Museo de Abejas, or the Honeybee Museum near Jerez. So going towards like Tarifa and the Strait of Gibraltar over to Morocco. But this family had been farmers and then beekeepers, and then when their father passed away, the children wanted to continue it, but they knew they couldn't continue it in the way that they had been. So their way of adaptation was to create this museum, which also housed a restaurant and also educational opportunities where they would take youth and other people out for field visits. So agritourism was becoming their practice. And having the opportunity to meet with more beekeepers, to work with technicians who were helping the industry, to also becoming a volunteer scientist on an international, what's called COLOS or colony losses working group. This is a photo of bee scientists from around Europe predominantly. We had a meeting in Toledo, Spain, which if you ever have the opportunity to go to Toledo, it's a medieval city. It's very, very exquisite visually, and you can see all sorts of things there. And recognizing again, how to build this bridge, at least of communication between the field and academia. So, the farmers here, this happened while I was there. There was a huge farmer protest where they took to their tractors and drove all the way to Madrid to voice their concerns about fair pricing and access. And the beekeepers did the same thing. And I really got to see, this sort of, again, how these individual organisms or individual farmers acting like bees in a sense and becoming a superorganism. And we see that with various things, even, with our own government here, a lone voice is rarely heard, but collectively can really project messages of needs and hopes and of resilience, right? So this is actually the olive grower who I rented a small home from at his hacienda, where he has his olive groves, and he's pointing out to me where the bees were in that other shop. I also had the opportunity to visit beekeepers, with these technical groups, and to hear their stories and to start interviewing some of them, which I'm still working on putting together in a small podcast. But I got to drive through Granada, and so this is actually the Sierra Nevadas. This is the Almond Bloom in the Sierra Nevadas, and so seeing this sort of the stark crisp freshness of the mountains with this fragile spring bloom. And it's very similar to what happens here in North America, in California as well. And visiting also other bee researchers, not so much honeybee beekeepers or bee scientists, but other solitary bee scientists at what was called EcoFlora, which was a pollinator ecology conference. Had the opportunity to go to Italy and visit with breeders and do a presentation for them. And then this is where I was based at the Universidad de Córdoba, which is their ag and environment school. And this was their apiculture center, which is connected to the veterinary department. They actually had not had much funding, so the center wasn't in full operation, but they still had a lot of equipment, and so were able to host me for my research. And however, I was just about to launch my field trials when the pandemic hit. So I actually left a bunch of some research equipment there that at some point I'll go back and finish up. But really knowing that these are opportunities to share stories, not just my own, but to really highlight the intensity of this type of industry, because we don't necessarily recognize always where our food comes from or how connected it is to our landscapes, and how we are a part of that story, and our actions can really impact how that plays out in our larger food system, whether it's making things accessible or making them healthier and affordable. It's all connected. And so I really treasure the opportunities that I've had with National Geographic to share stories about bees and beekeepers, and to become a more nuanced storyteller, and to share that whole journey. So just a few more shots here of some of the cool folks and people. This is actually one of my muses, I call her. This is Mia McNeil Draper, who I really credit with encouraging me to use my voice as a storyteller. She writes a lot for the American Bee Journal and Bee Culture magazines, and her and I met in 2007, and by her prompting, I've now been published in those trade magazines, at least 1 to 2 articles every year since 2007. So she's really a big mentor to me. And why do I do all this? It's really for the next generation. This is a photo of my daughter right here. That previous shot where you saw some of my tribal community members, that was a photo of my son smiling at the camera. And so my hope is that, my efforts can help to add to the continuity and to the legacies of future generations in whatever they decide to do. And that is that. This is actually a beautiful encaustic painting. So one of the other things I'm becoming more and more interested in, you would think you get tired of beekeeping, but there's always something new, is encaustic arts. And so using various Hive products to do some really cool things. I actually had my first small exhibit this past March in Taos, New Mexico, with some really cool beeswax sculptures that my bees and I collaborated on. But this is a beautiful painting by George Hansen, who's a good friend of mine, who's a wonderful beekeeper and encaustic artist. And so it really does take a community. And I will share the link to this story maps in the chat. And here's a few other links here on various things that you can read more about with my varying adventures. You can follow me on Instagram. This is my farm Instagram site, which is the Queen Bees is the name of my farm. And I do participate a lot with slow bees and of course share honey. This is my farm symbol. And for those who aren't familiar with the Zia sun symbol, I modified it to have a hexagon in the middle, but it's an homage to one of our tribal communities here in our state. And each of the rays signifies a very important aspect of life. So the top four are directions: northeast, southwest. The next four are the seasons: spring, summer, winter, fall. The bottom four are stages of time, meaning day, or I'm sorry, dawn, day, dusk, and night. And then the final four are the stages of life. So infancy, adolescence, adulthood, and elderhood. So in a sense, the Zia sun symbol is actually a life symbol, a symbol for life. And that is that. So I will stop share. I know I went a little bit over, I apologize, but hopefully that was entertaining. And thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. That was great. And we do have a few questions from our audience, so I'm going to pull those up. And this one was in the chat. This is a fascinating story, Melanie. Thanks for telling your story. Can you share more info about what we can do as lovers of bees but non-beekeepers to support your work and other efforts to support healthy, sustainable apiculture?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, the honest truth is that it all, you all are geographers, right? So we know how important just the land itself is, or at least the landscapes, and it does start from the soil up, and so a lot of it is rooted in soil health. And so finding those groups that are promoting healthy soils, healthy land stewardship practices, but even for those who are, say live in a high-rise apartment and don't necessarily have a yard and can't have bees, you can always plant flowers, even potted plants on a balcony or in a open window can add to the available habitat and forage. And there's a lot of urban beekeepers, believe it or not, people who are putting hives on rooftops or doing community projects. I've done a few collaborations with a group in Kansas City called Hives, Missouri Hives, and they are all about taking inner city kids out to learn about bees and gardening and all sorts of pollinator stuff. So there's a lot of really cool groups out there. And I recently started a network called the Adaptive Bee Breeders Alliance for sort of this continuing generation and next generation of bee breeders, because when I got into it, it was hard to find the mentors, and especially when I'm coming to it also too from a very different perspective, as an Indigenous person. So my worldview is very rooted in not only my personal and spiritual aspects, but definitely in my professional aspects, which some people really separate those, but for some cultures that's not separated. Your work is a reflection of you. And so I don't judge, other people, but for me, that's pretty critical. And so I decided to form this working group. And so we're just launching, we're trying to get off the ground here, but yeah, folks are more than welcome to email me if they want to try and help support those efforts. So.
Awesome, thank you so much. Here's our next question. You commented that there was a very different taste to the honey in your collection that was made by the stingless bees. Are you aware if there's any mechanism that causes the difference, or is it merely a coincidence?
With the stingless bees, you know, I'm sure a lot of it has to do with metabolism. You know, honey in itself comes from nectar, but it's not exactly nectar, right? I mean, the bees are collecting it, they're adding enzymes to it, and then through what's called trophallaxis, they're passing it from one bee to the other. We call that the bee kiss, and then it gets mixed with more enzymes, and then it gets packed away, and then it gets fanned or dehydrated. And so depending on those enzymatic processes and the species of bee, yeah, that's going to be very distinct. So what I found was for me, it had a very almost fermenty kind of flavor or taste to it, kind of soury. It was still sweet, I should say, not Swedish, but sweetish. It was very different. And I felt like it had a lot more pollen sort of in it too, you know, which honey does have trace amounts of pollen in it. So I'm sure that also added to it too. And also the processing, like once you collect it, you know, with the stingless bees, they keep much smaller nests. They make their little combs are more like stacked like little pancakes, which is really cute. And they don't have just one queen, they actually have multiple princesses, which is kind of neat. But a lot of it too is really just rooted in the flora that's in that landscape. So stingless bees are predominantly found in subtropical and tropical climates. I recently read an article though, how there had been some brought over to California for some research. Then they hadn't seen them in a while, and they were recently found again in Palo Alto. So we do have some stingless bees here in the US, but in terms of them being, you know, having a traditional practice here in this country, we don't have that history. But there is a huge practice, like in Mayan cultures. There's actually a huge women's cooperative that works with stingless bees. And so depending on how they're extracting those honeys and, you know, all the flowers that those bees are visiting in those particular landscapes, that'll definitely change the flavor.
Absolutely. Cool. Thank you.
Mhm.
This person is wondering if there's a doctorate in your future.
I definitely am thinking about it. Interestingly enough, you know, having been in the field for so long, just as a farmer beekeeper, and then I went back to school, and I love learning. And when I first, you know, got going into grad school, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, like maybe I should continue. And then of course, by the time I was finishing, I was like, I just want to be done. You know? Plus the pandemic had hit, and it was like, who knew where the world was going? We didn't know where the world was going, but it's definitely still on my list. I'm a non-traditional student in that I'm definitely in the middle aged, and I kind of wonder, like, to what end, you know, like, what do I want to, you know, do I want a doctorate to be a professor, or do I want a doctorate to do what? I will be honest, I want a doctorate so that I can be one of the few people who can collect germplasm and be able to bring it and share it, and and you have to have those kind of advanced credentials in order to do that. But also too, I really want to be able to make my community proud. You know, my mother's an educator. She long told me that education will set you free, and I've always remembered that. And you know, I feel like there's something to be said about also mentorship. So I'm hitting that point in my life where I really want to pay it forward and to help nurture and mentor the next generation. So we'll see what happens. I'm definitely, I would consider it. It's a matter of when and where. But I'm not getting any younger, so I need to kind of move on it if I'm going to do it, you know. Yeah.
How many miles from the hive do bees usually travel?
Good question. They will travel, you know, textbooks say up to 5 miles. For honeybees in particular, because they're generalist pollinators, and they're also bigger than, you know, some of the smaller, say, little sweat bees or alkaline bees. And so a lot of those solitary bee species or the smaller bee species, you know, they stay within a really small radius, and that's why they're also very flower specific. They've co-evolved with these particular blooms, you know, like those orchids too that are only pollinated by a particular, you know, moth or wasp. And so with honeybees, though, they can fly much farther. The farther they go, though, the more energy they're expending. So then the less they're able to really bring home for their family, right? So as a beekeeper, we really try and ensure that they have enough within a half mile to 2.5 miles. There's a wonderful book out called 2 Million Blossoms, written by a good friend of mine named Dr. Kirsten Trainer. And she recently relocated to Germany and is running a bee lab there. But she wrote this great book called 2 Million Blossoms, which has kind of become this, this mathematical magic number of how many flowers it takes for a hive to be able to make enough to survive. In those areas where there's a lot of bloom, I mean, given space, the bees will pack away more than they need, and so that's where we can harvest what's extra if there's extra, but we always have to be really mindful of that. You don't want to take too much. And again, with these shifting patterns or lack thereof anymore, it becomes a real guessing game, and hindsight's always 2020. I'll be honest with you, this year I was expecting and anticipating major drought conditions because we've had that for a while here in the West, but sadly, while the West Coast and Montana and all those places were having major wildfires this year, we had one of our best and glorious monsoon seasons this summer that I haven't seen like this in 10 years. So we had a really phenomenal honey year this year. And that totally threw me for a loop because I was expecting doomsday, I really was. But I have beekeeper collaborators and friends who, struggled this year, who had to do a lot of feeding. I'm really more of the mindset of, it's a catch-22. While I don't want to advocate for burning fossil fuels, I would much rather choose to put my bees on the truck and take them to new pastures versus having to just feed them sugar water, so there's management always kind of comes into play, and you have to try and figure out, like what works for you, what feels good for you philosophically, but also, how to reconcile that. I don't own any land, not by choice. I mean, I would love to actually have my own property, but it's been unaffordable, really, because land here in the West is so expensive, especially if you want something with water, right? But instead of looking at that as like an unattainable situation where it's like, well, then I can't have bees, it really forced me to be creative. And I realized, wow, I can actually connect more with my community because there's a lot of small farmers in our area who need pollination. And so they're willing to share space. And so I get to test out different genetics in different elevations and in different landscapes. And then also in the good years, get different kinds of honey by having them spread out. But it does, then I do spend more time and money on fuel, which has its negative, attributes. We've got one veggie oil vehicle, and we'll see if we can convert the other. But it's always, there's the ideal world of how we would love everything to be. And then there's the world we live in and these various constructs that have really taken root. But I think things are changing, and we're seeing, I think, more people recognize, but also acknowledge. And then I think we'll see acceptance. And then I think we'll see more adaptation and inclusivity in how we approach not only agriculture, but just even land stewardship in general. So I feel like these are exciting yet frightening times to be in this industry.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. We have a few more questions here. This one is, can you explain how beeswax is produced by the bees?
Yeah, so they have glands that are underneath their little, what we call scale plates, so to speak. And so they will actually, only during a certain time of their life. So when a honeybee is born, she has different stages of her sort of career as a family member. And she'll start off as a housekeeper bee, which is really just getting to learn the smells within the hive until they're their hypopharyngeal glands will kick in, and then they're able to produce royal jelly. And so royal jelly is not sweet. It's actually quite sour. It looks and tastes like yogurt, to be honest. Or colostrum, like the first milk, mother's milk. And they actually then use that to feed other young and to feed the queen. Once they're done with being a nurse bee, which is, I think about 3 days in from birth is when those glands kick in, and then they'll do that for a little bit of time. Then they become a guard bee, where they're actually now at the entrance and can start to learn the smells and sort of the sight, so to speak, of the outside world. Because you have to, envision their most of their life is spent in the dark, living inside this trunk or this, container of sorts, and their abode. And so when they come out, then everything's really, sensory, but all of their sort of nervous system and all, they've reached an age now of adolescence where they're able to go out into the world, and they then become familiar with not only the sights and the smells, but also with navigation. So they do what's called the Waggle Dance, and they, will communicate on their central nervous system comb, right, dancing and rotating. And it really, they use the sun to navigate, so that's why we see them most active during the day. And then they'll go out and collect not only nectars, but pollen. So the nectar is their carbohydrate, the pollen is their protein. They'll collect water. They'll collect propolis, which is resin from trees and shrubs, and they use that as sort of a antibiotic or antiseptic glue within their hive. And then, they bring these resources home, and then that's kind of the journey of their life. But when they're producing wax, it's at a younger age, and it's also only really during the time of year when there's a lot of what we call a nectar flow, a heavy nectar flow. So they can consume a lot of it and raise their temperature, and then basically they sweat it out is what they do. I'm going to try something here. We'll see if it works. So one of the background images I was going to share was this other photo, but it's a great photo of a bee sweating wax. So I will show it to you right now. And if I move out of the way, you can see these little wax platelets that she's actually excreting. And then they get passed from sister to sister and pressed into these hexagons. And actually what they found is that they're not actually making hexagons, they're making circles. But when they connect all the circles together, then that gives us the hexagon, right? And it's structurally just insanely strong, and also can hold the most volume. So, they can rear their young in it. They can store a lot of honey in it. They also construct it at such an angle so that the honey doesn't fall out, right? Like the nectar, when they're first kind of curing it, it can be very watery. And then as they fan it to dehydrate it, they, because if they left it too watery, it would ferment and become wine, right? I don't think they'd be able to survive that long with too much alcohol. So they're smart enough, really intelligent beings for sure. And how they figured this all out, I think that's one of the things that I'm a very hyperactive person. Always, it's only now that I've gotten older, especially through grad school, that I realized, oh, I have some attention issues. I just keep myself super busy, But one of the reasons I've loved working with the bees is they're my therapy. They really do kind of put me in the zone, and just marveling at not only their abilities, but their behavior. And also there's a whole other realm too of beekeeping called apitherapy, which is really looking at hive medicine. So whether you're using the wax, which actually does have some nutritional value, a lot of bakers use it, but also can be used in salves and balms and making polishes. The honey, of course, is medicinal, and depending on these different kinds of plants. The oregano research I did, we were looking at the medicinal aspects of that nectar. And, in the end, it's, food is medicine, and the bees know that. I sometimes call them the winged midwives of agriculture. They really are so nuanced. They're the world's first herbalists, really. They know what nectars they need and what's available, and how to make it, work for their family. if they have that, right? In those compromised landscapes where they don't have it. I think I read something, it was a number of years ago, how somebody was finding, red honey in their hives, like near New York City, and it was like from the maraschino factory. And they are creatures, just like everybody else. They're very opportunistic. And so if you put something there that's really sweet, they're going to find it, but collectively they kind of gather all these things and are able to keep themselves healthy. So I hope that helped about the wax a little bit. I'm sorry, that was a long-winded answer. I kind of started talking about all sorts of stuff, but yeah, they'll produce it during a certain period in their life when they're kind of younger. And then as they get older, sort of those glands really kind of shrivel up, and then the energy goes more towards what we call the mushroom bodies in their brains, where they can, to help with navigation. And they've got a different role now, right? Where they're out foraging and finding resources. So
that is so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm telling you, I've gone down this rabbit hole and I still haven't surfaced. It's just amazing. It's a whole lab, it's a whole universe. It's a maze.
We have one last question here.
Sure.
When you purchase a certain specific flavor of honey, how and why do certain bees pollinate only specific blossoms?
It really does depend on the landscape. Like, for instance, here in New Mexico, because we're such an arid region, our bees pretty much produce what you call multifloral honeys, because when it rains, everything blooms, right? But there are certain areas where there's so much of just one kind of bloom that you can get what's called a monofloral sort of varietal. Like, for instance, orange blossom, right? Or alfalfa. Or clover. And so, in those particular areas, that's like the predominant bloom, but most likely there's probably a little bit of other, nectars in there, but there can be a more predominant sort of nectar. There are also infused honeys too, where people will kind of have just whatever honey they have access to, and then they can infuse it or steep it with various, whether it's herbs or flowers. The oregano honey, we actually had the oregano honey that we harvested, and then we actually put dried oregano flowers in there. And it was, not only was it candy, but it was medicine, and it looked beautiful because you saw those purple flowers and they're just floating in this liquid. So there's all sorts of really cool things you can do. But yeah, it's predominantly, for the monofloral honeys, it's because those beekeepers are taking their bees to an area where that's the predominant bloom in that area. But yeah, most honeys in general will have, of course, a combination. And the way they can check this out is, of course, microscopically, but they can also use gas spectrometry and look at the different pollen grains that are in there, and then really try and figure out. So there's a huge thing with what's called honey anti-dumping issues, because we do have some honey coming in from some countries that may have some residues, like agricultural residues, and they're rerouting it and relabeling it, and unsuspecting buyer may not know it, but there's actually an organization called the National Honey Board, and they're real big advocates on trying to minimize those honeys that are coming in erroneously. There's always more demand than I think can be produced. And in fact, in in 2008 was when one of the first years that the industry really experienced a shift in income with beekeepers. Most of their money at that point in time had been coming from honey production, but in that year, it had switched to most of their income being generated from pollination. So you have a lot of producers who focus on just pollination and not honey production. So they're actually not really harvesting honey, even though, we have a lot of beekeepers. And in general, to be honest, honeybees have been, they're the poster child of pollinators and of bee species, but they've also been extremely exploited, and that's just been one of the fallouts of industrialized agriculture. You go in the store and you see like maybe 4 different kinds of potatoes, but in reality, there's like over 200 varieties of potatoes, right? So same with these bees, like, we tend to just think of honeybees, but there's really so many other species. And so that's one of the things too that I really appreciate about learning from the bees, from honeybees in particular, is that they've broadened my awareness to the diversity of pollinators and just biodiversity in general. And, honeybees have been exploited in that we, that's kind of our go-to when we think of, oh, we need bees, let's get honeybees. But when there's, like anything that's oversaturated, then it becomes a problem, because then there's over competition for resources, and that can have some spillover effects as well on other pollinator species. So there's a real, that's the fragility of it, like on the one hand, things are really, nature tough, but some people say nature versus nurture. I say nature nurtures and tortures. But there's definitely a need for us to really keep in mind all of the various pollinators, and we do need more bees and we do need more beekeepers, but not all in the same place, right? We need to be able to kind of spread these out and not oversaturate, not only our attention, but also our abilities on just one species, because then if they collapse, right, what happens to, the whole industry or agriculture or food production if we're only relying on one species? That's not sustainable. So there are folks who use like alfalfa leafcutter bees or bobs, like blue orchard bees for certain crop pollinations. And one of the reasons that honeybees have really kind of become the poster child is because they are generalist pollinators, so they can pollinate a variety of things. They are manageable, meaning that they can adapt to different landscapes, so you can move them to different landscapes. And they do produce extra, where a lot of these other solitary bee species really only collect and produce just enough for their own nest. They don't have the extra resources, or they don't have I guess I would say the interest or drive to produce more. But with bees, if they have space, they'll just keep packing it away, even if they have more than enough. It's amazing. Like that one shot where you saw the hive tower, right? Like they don't actually need that much, but they had space, and so they'll just keep working, and I think that's when they're at their happiest. But I know I shouldn't anthropomorphize, but I know I'm always happy when I'm working. So or vacationing, but those are rare blue moons.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You've given such beautiful, thorough answers to everything, and I know we're all appreciative of that. And in the Q&A, aside from the questions, we had multiple people saying, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, and you're a great storyteller. So we all
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always looking to learn, so suggestions and constructive criticism is very welcome. There was just sort of a quick anecdotal story to kind of wrap this up. I heard a story recently on the news about an astronaut who had gone up into space, and that one of the things he really recognized, he said, even though he was off the ground and into orbit, at that moment when he looked back and saw the Earth, that's when he realized how connected we all are to each other. And I have to really say that that's what the bees have done for me. They've given me this opportunity to kind of live in this outer world, human world, but looking down at them and their universe, it just makes me see how interconnected we are, and how there can be good and bad in everything, and there can be dark times and light times, but they themselves are definitely beings of light, sweetness and light.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melanie.